Folks, it's taken 8 months, 6 different tyre widths, 4 identical wheel sets, hundreds of test kilometres, including more late night repeats than I'd like to imagine. But let me tell you this, it's been worth it. Today we are finally going to dig into the tyre testing we've been doing this year. And before you think, no, not more tyre testing, sure, haven't we heard it all before? I promise you this is different. This wasn't done on a drum or a velodrome. It wasn't based on time, power, or out and backs alone. It was done in the real world, on real roads, smooth roads, semi-rough roads, and properly rough tarmac. With attention to detail like never before, using the same test equipment and test protocol that Dan Bigham, World Tour teams, and tyre manufacturers alike are all converging on now. This detail matters because the results have left us questioning much of what we've learned in the past decade or so of tyre progress. For years, we've all been told that wider and lower is faster. We're sold the idea of lower pressures with wider tyres and better comfort and more grip and less rolling resistance. We've been told we can't trust what feels fast is fast and that we must trust tyre pressure calculators. We've been told the rule of 105, we've been told all sorts, and more recently we've been told that 35 and 40mm tyres may be just as fast for many riders. What we're finding is not all of that might hold up when tested in the real world. These aren't the questions we set out with. What I wanted to do was build a tyre testing leaderboard, a reliable list of what's fast and what's not in the real world, but they are just a few of the answers that came up in this 8 months of testing. Today we'll delve into those and the other things we've uncovered, new understandings about the impact of temperature, the importance of tyre pressure and circumference, and the slip angle effect of applying power to the rear wheel. For 8 months, I've been the test dummy, the rider repeating the same runs and again, changing one tyre width or one tyre pressure at a time. And throughout, I've been using the Streamlines Alto-Stratus Cirrus system. If you've listened to the previous episode with Streamlines, you'll know what that system is all about and why it's an incredibly precise, portable setup that captures what's happening on the real world in real time. Today, though, we're focusing on what the system has allowed us to find. I'm joined once again by John Buckley from Streamlines, the person who spent countless hours turning all my test runs into usable data, refining the test protocol, the test portal, and generally making sense of the chaos I've been creating. Together, we'll go through how we ran the tests, why our approach is different and why that matters, and what the results actually tell us about tyre width, pressure, and performance. Because while this wasn't lab testing, that was exactly the point. So, John, apologies for the exceptionally long intro. I felt it was required. Anyway, welcome back to the show.
Okay, no, thanks. It's a great intro. Thank you.
I think I covered pretty much everything here, didn't I?
Maybe even a bit more. Maybe you've oversold it. Let's see.
Yeah, I did warn you there might be a bit of overselling involved in it, but yeah, we're here anyway. We've been working together on this project since I think you first floated the idea to me at Eurobike in 2024.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've kind of said we've had this capability, and then I think you came back with a massive matrix. I suggest you might want to cut that down a bit. And yeah, I think you can relate now, I think. So
yeah, for sure. I mean, listeners of the podcast who have heard you on before talking about Streamlines and the Alto-Stratus system will know that is a drag measurement system typically used for aerodynamic purposes. Can you maybe just kick us off with like the elevator pitch for what Streamlines does? Because listeners who really want to delve into that can go back to the previous episode, and then maybe just get us into why we're looking at a system like that for tyre testing when we had previously been talking about it for aero testing.
Yeah, so I mean, we call it the Cirrus system, and the Alto-Stratus is the sort of the wind sensor on it. The cloud names are hard. So anyway, we've got a system now. So the reason we refer to it as a system and it's not as like an individual sensor is that what this boils down to for aerodynamic testing in the real world, it's basically an energy capture system. We try to capture where all the energy goes while the cyclist is cycling. What we do then is for a typical aerodynamic test, we actually will fix and we'll estimate the Ronan resistance. And then from that, we measure differences in aerodynamic drag and output them as a CDA number. And alternatively, what we can also do though is we can actually start with an estimate of Ronan resistance. We can then take that CDA measurement and then we don't change the rider position or the equipment on the bike. We can say that actually we can start changing the tires, the tire pressure which will affect the rolling resistance, but we will assume that the aerodynamic characteristics, which are the CDA, and then also, which is a little bit higher levels, some things relating to variation of Reynolds number and the sail effect, we can say that that's holding constant because we're not changing those things. So that's the sort of top level thing. And then, I guess we can delve a bit more into the differences.
I think that's a good place to kick us off, though, because you've already briefly explained there that you're estimating rolling resistance, calculate CDA, and then using that calculation to go back and calculate rolling resistance, which you've already estimated. And for a lot of people, there might be red flags going off already, alarm bells ringing. Do you want to tell us why that holds up and it isn't maybe as...
I'll try to give a quick recap here, or a quick overview, to say that when we say that we measure all the energy on the bike, we simplify it to 5 areas. We say simplest one is rider power, and will include like transmission efficiency within that, but it's almost the number you see on your power meter, and that's the sort of input power. We then have, you can call gradient or gravitational power, which is, are you going uphill or downhill? And we measure that very precisely, on the order of 5 or 10 centimeters over a kilometer. And so we can very precisely measure whether you're gaining or losing any energy relative to your change in altitude over that measurement. We finally have the kinetic energy, which is then we take your starting speed and your ending speed and say, did your kinetic energy change during that? And it always does a tiny bit, but we can measure that, we can record that. Now, the 2 variables left are the rolling resistance and the aerodynamic drag. Now, rolling resistance for a given stretch of road is actually a bit simpler in that generally modeled as being as a pretty consistent force regardless of speed. If you had a very smooth road, or such as on a velodrome, general assumption is that the force slowing the bike down as that tire rolls is consistent across all speeds. Now, there are some caveats to that. You can imagine on a bumpy road, you might be able to roll at a slower speed, and at a higher speed, the force might go up because you might start skipping across the bumps, or you might start shaking a lot. But we work to the general assumption that within a given speed range, that the rolling resistance is presenting a pretty consistent force on it. At higher speeds, the same force requires more power. Just as a note on that so if we double our speed, the power required to overcome the rolling resistance will also double. The aerodynamic forces they have some different characteristics. The aerodynamic forces vary with the square of the speed. So the rolling resistance, we say for the simplified model, it doesn't vary with speed at all, but with the aerodynamic resistance, it's going up with the square of the speed. I think, as we mentioned in the previous podcast, it's not entirely true in that with modern skin suits and things, there is a slight reduction in that, and we do take that into account. But what we can say, though, is that if we have a relatively smooth section of road, the estimate we have for the rolling resistance actually holds pretty solid, because we don't need to have the exact speed, and a smooth road can be pretty well simulated on a drum or something like that. And so luckily the tire manufacturers, or you can go to rollingresistance.com, which has a very economical yearly subscription, and you can get numbers from there. And there's other published numbers. And so we generally use that. And so all we really need is a ballpark number for that. And I've written a paper to show why that any error you have in that initial estimate, if it's small, as you go to rougher and rougher roads, that initial error holds constant. So as long as that estimate is close, we say we can't give you the exact rolling resistance that you have, but we can measure changes very well. So we don't know the absolute number of what the split is between aerodynamic drag and rolling resistance, but we can give a pretty good estimate, and we give a very accurate measurement of what the difference between 2 given setups are for the change in rolling resistance if they keep the same aerodynamic package.
I guess the strange thing about this podcast we're about to do is that I've been conducting this testing for 8 months, and still you have to convince me during this hour that what we've been doing has been worthwhile.
Yeah.
And I can comprehend much of what you're saying. You've been the brains behind this testing, and effectively you've been as engaged as much of your time has been taking on this as well. You're confident that this approach holds up when we then get into testing differences between different tire widths and different tire pressures, and yeah, you're confident that this is a sound direction to go in.
Yes. So I'll say here, and I think we can even divulge. Ronan and I discussed we wouldn't go that. We try to avoid going on rabbit holes, but I reserved this particular rabbit hole. So yeah, what I think here, what I want to say is that make a slight differentiation between a simulation of, say, a real world result and the measurement of the real world result itself. So if we wanted to, let's say we had somebody who ran a 20 ktt and a 40 ktt, then we could give a pretty good estimate of what their 30 ktt time would be just from previous results. You could even probably just measure their speed. Then you could start including athlete models for fatigue, but you could give a pretty good estimate from that. You could also try and predict their TT time from looking at their VO2 and from looking at their frontal area. You could give good estimates, but those are much more simulations to where you are extrapolating knowledge, or you're looking up tables of knowledge. And you can argue, for instance, in this method, we use that for the initial CRR measurement, and that is true. But all the measurements we took were actually measuring all of these things in the real world, and then the differences between them are really interpolations. So we've measured across all the airspeeds that you've run, we've measured all the wind angles, we know the elevation change, and so therefore all we're really doing is saying, we can say in between those results, we can interpolate them between them very accurately. It gets complicated because some of those terms are nonlinear. I mean, the most obvious one being CDA. There are some others such as the sail effect, and we will go into the temperature compensation, which ended up being the biggie from this test. That was the big, yes, that's the big surprise here. But the reason that I wanted to stress this or go deep on this particular topic is that I think that there's a lot of discussion about how to assess the validity of, different results you see. And I'll say that for something that's more of a simulation, I think that it's not just the consistency, which is also the precision of the result, but it's the correlation to the real world, to the real world example, that it gives the same results. The extreme example here would be computer simulations, whether it be a race simulation or CFD. Its consistency is outstanding because, in this case, it can provide the exact same conditions every time. However, the question is over how well does it represent the real world? And so in our case here, we are testing the real world. We might not be testing on every road that there ever was, but we tested on 3 different roads. And here we are saying that actually these 3 roads are pretty representative of a lot of the roads that people will be riding on. And then we measured the speed that you rode over those roads. And we said, actually, in this case here, accounting for your power, accounting for the wind speed, you rode slower with this tire or you rode faster with this tire. And I really believe that it's a much more definitive measurement of what's faster and what's slower. There's far fewer assumptions than a more simulation-based measurement. And whether you're on a rolling drum or a wind tunnel, you're still making a lot of assumptions and extrapolations to get from there to the real-world example. Here, we have the real-world example. Our problem isn't about making it realistic. Our problem is the noise of the environment. At the real world, we have wind, we have cars, we have I don't think we had, I mean, maybe it rained and canceled. You had cows one day. We didn't test with the
cows weren't the problem. It was what the cows left behind was the problem.
Yes. We can't account for cows.
That maybe gets into why it's so important, we believe, to use something like your Altostratus drag measurement system, because those variables, not just day to day, but run to run, can make or break. Like, a listener might have taken from what you just said that, oh, you can do an out and back and time it, and whichever one is faster was the faster tire or the faster pressure. But there's so many variables that can occur within each run. We really can't.
Yeah. So then what becomes is the consistency. So if you think you have a method that works well, what I would say is do it 5 times or do it 10 times. And what is your consistency? And I think here what we can say is we're happy to publish the results and show every traverse and say, this is the consistency. We have raw numbers, and then we can normalize for these factors. And the standard deviation goes down through all these normalizations until you get quite a consistent result, despite changes in temperature, changes in wind speed, small variations in your road speed, and some variations in rider power, that we can account for these as long as they're within, a certain window. For instance, we take rider power. I think it's generally you're about 180 to 220 over most of the testing, but that's an allowable window. We couldn't do one run at 200 and one run at 20 watts because won't go into it, but that would be outside of our window. So just to reiterate there, I think the biggest thing there is, to kind of go back to the previous point, is I think the judgment should be consistency. That do you get the same result every time? And I think that was why we, kind of insisted on this test, and that you did a lot of repeats, and that you did repeats, before and after each variation whenever possible. And then we can, I don't know, we want to do the, spoil the surprise here a bit, but the first thing that came up was the big temperature variation.
When you're saying repeats, so you mean baseline repeats, or not?
Yes.
And
yes.
I think it's the amount of times that we returned to baseline and repeated that at times it felt so tedious, and at times it just felt like I wanted to pick up the bike and throw it as far as I could so that I would never see it again. But actually that's what has enabled yourself, John, to then extrapolate what you have or understand what you have from the results.
Yes, because then we can say we're confident in the system. And unless somebody has done that work, you can't say you're confident in the system, until you know that you have that consistency, because you can't just assume you have that consistency. And to be honest, we didn't have that consistency until we added in the temperature compensation for the tires, but that's a spoiler. So,
just before we do move on to the findings, I want to get into some of the other controls that we had first of all. And so we were using the same clothing, same helmet, same bike throughout. We used 4 identical Princeton Carbon Works dual 5550 wheel sets. So Princeton kindly gave us 4 wheel sets for this testing, which meant that we could have 4 different tire widths ready to go each time we went testing, which actually just made this possible. Wouldn't have been possible without that, to test as much as we did. We also controlled things like body position. You've got your Forma sensor there that checks that I was holding the same position through each run, which is critical. And then down to, like, we had picked 4 different tire pressures at the start, I think. We eventually narrowed that down, but the process for which I ensured that each tire we were running was at the same pressure was dialed in as well. We had a repeatable process there. It had got to the point where I was using a torque wrench on the through axis to make sure there was no chance. I don't think that makes any difference, but I wanted to make sure there was no difference. And so every through axle ever put into that bike was tightened to the same torque. I'd removed the brake pads from the front brakes just to, again, this is one issue that popped up that one night we had brake pads rubbing, and so to avoid that the next night we took them out, and so there was a lot that went into this. The test venues also, it became quite apparent quite quickly that doing it at nighttime meant they would be much quieter and it would make for easier testing, and so quite a little of this testing was done either very late at night or very early in the morning, which again allowed us to uncover the temperature stuff we'll get into in a bit. And just before we do move on, we described those as smooth, semi-rough, and rough in the results that we'll be presenting. Do you want to give us like a rolling resistance figures, or what's the best way to maybe quantify for listeners what those surfaces were? Because that's obviously a critical aspect here as well.
The speed here, I think, is at 35 kilometers an hour. You were doing 35 watts, which was, we've got a rolling resistance. We estimated around 0.0043 for the smooth. Might be a touch low, but as I said, it's just really an offset for it. For the medium road, we got about a 20% or precisely an 18% increase. So it went from 35 up to 41 watts. And then on the rough road, the rolling resistance went up to about 0.006 or about a 40% increase. And now we're at 49 watts. So kind of 35 watts, 41 watts, and 49 watts. And Ronan, you can probably describe the surface for each of those roads.
Yeah, the smooth is actually just a greenway. It was only laid a few years ago at this point, but it's effectively a brand new surface. It never sees any traffic. It's as smooth as we have in this area. It's as smooth as you're going to find, I think. The semi-rough is just a standard road, but it's been well used, and you would ride down it, you wouldn't think twice about it, but it is significantly rougher than the smooth stuff. And then finally, the rough road that we used is a stretch of road very close to my house here that was previously a main road, and there's now a dual carriageway alongside it that was built about 10 or 15 years ago. This old road still exists, but it is badly cut up, and it's like you ride through this on a race bike with your tires pumped up. It's not pleasant, to the point that I will quite often just choose the dual carriageway, even though it's like so much busier with traffic. So it's my justification for this road was it's rough enough that I don't want to ride it. And given some of the roads I have around here, I think that stands for that says enough about it. So yeah, that's kind of how we landed on the 3 different surfaces, because ultimately I think the only thing we can say for certain is the results are accurate on the road that I have. Your road may vary, but by doing it on 3 surfaces, we've covered quite a lot of ground, pardon the pun. We've teased it for long enough. Let's get into the actual findings here. And I mean, I say that, but we also have a full written article live on escapecollective.com as you're hearing this. So listeners really should jump into that to go through. We've listed out the 6 lessons, I think it is, that we have taken from, or I've taken from this testing, broken each one of those down. Listeners should read those. We're not going to go through each of them right now, but we will go through some of the findings and how we arrived upon them and give a bit more insight into that. And perhaps the one to start with is... Okay, folks, that's where we're cutting off the free version of this podcast this week. Just a reminder, if you head over to escapecollective.com/member, you can sign up now and you can get the entire podcast uninterrupted. You'll not have me butting in to cut you off or to remind you that you're not yet a member. And in doing so, you will be helping to ensure this podcast continues for many more episodes and months and years to come. So head over escapecollective.com/member now to sign up to Escape Collective and to get the entire episode of Performance Process, along with all of the other podcasts and written content that we publish on our website.